Nashville, March 1969. Studio B at RCA. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of creative tension that happened when the South's best session musicians gathered in one room. The studio itself was legendary, where Elvis had recorded some of his greatest hits, where Roy Orbison had found his voice, where country and R&B had been quietly merging for years in ways the rest of the world was just beginning to understand. Duane Allman had driven up from Macon with his Gibson Les Paul and his medicine bottle slide, the same Coricidin bottle he'd been using since his teenage years in Daytona Beach. He'd arrived early, as was his habit, setting up his rig with the precision of a surgeon. His amplifier settings were memorized, each knob positioned exactly where he needed it to make his slide talk. The other session players knew to give him space. When Duane Allman was working, the studio became his temple. At 22, Dwayne was already being called the best slide guitarist in the South, maybe the best anywhere. His work on Wilson Pickett's Hey Jude had just been released, and every guitarist from Atlanta to Memphis was trying to figure out how he made that slide sing like a human voice. They'd study the recording, slow it down, try to decode the mystery of how he bent notes that shouldn't have been bendable, how he made the guitar cry and laugh and testify all at once. Dwayne knew he was special. More than special, he was defining what Southern rock could be. He'd grown up listening to his brother Greg play piano, but it was the slide guitar on old Tampa Red records that had spoken to his soul. He'd spent years perfecting a technique that combined the Delta blues tradition with a rock and roll aggression that nobody else could match. The medicine bottle on his finger wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of his voice, a way to make the guitar say things that words couldn't express. The session was supposed to start at 2 p.m., but musicians kept filtering in throughout the afternoon. Word had gotten out that Jimi Hendrix was in town, recording some experimental stuff with different players. Dwayne had heard the rumors but didn't pay much attention. He'd heard Jimmy's records, sure. Impressive volume, lots of effects, but not much soul. Not much blues truth. Around 4 p.m., Jimmy walked into Studio B carrying a sunburst Stratocaster. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, nothing like the psychedelic outfits from his album covers. He nodded to the room, found a corner, and plugged into a small Fender amp that someone had set up. The session musicians welcomed him politely. Everyone knew who he was, but this was Nashville. Credentials mattered less than what you could do in the room, with real musicians without overdubs or studio tricks. Dwayne watched from behind his music stand, adjusting his slide, waiting to see if the hype was real. They worked through a few R&B numbers, Jimmy playing rhythm mostly, staying out of the way, learning the arrangements. His playing was tasteful, understated, professional, but nothing that impressed Dwayne. Just another guitarist trying to fit into a session that required subtlety, not showmanship. During a break, someone mentioned that Dwayne had just finished tracking slide parts for a new Aretha song. "Play that thing you did on the bridge," the producer called out. "The one that made everyone stop talking." Dwayne smiled, picked up his Gibson, and slipped the glass slide over his pinky finger. He started playing the melody he'd laid down that morning, a weeping vocal line that seemed to bend the air itself. The slide moved across the strings like water, creating sounds that seemed impossible for 6 strings and some wood. Notes that cried and laughed and spoke in tongues. The room went quiet. Even the engineers stopped what they were doing and listened. This was slide guitar at its highest level, the technique pushed to its artistic limits. When Dwayne finished, there was that particular silence that happens when professional musicians recognize mastery. "That's beautiful, man," Jimmy said from his corner. Dwayne nodded his thanks, but he wasn't done talking. "This is what real guitar sounds like," he said, holding up the slide between his fingers. "Not effects, not volume, just you, the guitar, and the slide. Everything else is shortcuts." The room got quieter. Everyone understood they were witnessing something more than a casual comment. Dwayne was making a statement, establishing territory. "I mean, finger picking is fine," Dwayne continued, his voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear this wasn't casual conversation. "It's easier, I guess. More notes, more speed. But slide guitar, that's where the soul lives. That's where you can't hide behind technique." Jimmy didn't respond immediately. He sat perfectly still in his chair, his Stratocaster resting across his lap, listening to the words hang in the air. The session musicians exchanged glances. They knew Dwayne's reputation for speaking his mind, but calling out Jimi Hendrix in front of a room full of professionals was bold, even for him. "You play slide?" Dwayne asked, his question sounding more like a challenge. "Not really," Jimi said quietly. "Figured," Dwayne said, not meanly, but with the confidence of someone who'd just proven his point. "It's a different animal. Takes years to get the intonation right, years to make it sing instead of screech." Jimi stood up slowly, walked over to where Dwayne was sitting, and looked at the slide in Dwayne's hand. "Can I see that for a second?" Dwayne handed over the glass slide, curious but still confident. Jimi held it up to the light, examined it like he was seeing one for the first time, then handed it back. "That piece you just played," Jimi said. "Play it again." Dwayne looked at him strangely but picked up his guitar and played the melody again. The same weeping vocal line, the same impossible bends and sustained notes that made the slide sound like a human voice crying. When he finished, Jimi nodded. "Beautiful," he said again. Then he went back to his corner, picked up his Stratocaster, and started tuning it. The room was watching now. Everyone could feel something building, though nobody was sure what. Jimi finished tuning, adjusted his amp settings slightly, and then started playing. He played Dwayne's slide melody, but he played it with his fingers. No slide, no glass bottle, just fingertips on steel strings, bending notes that shouldn't have been possible to bend, creating the same vocal quality, the same weeping expressiveness that Dwayne had achieved with the slide, but doing it through pure finger technique and an understanding of the guitar that seemed to transcend the physical limitations of the instrument. The room went dead silent. Even the tape operator stopped rewinding reels. Everyone understood they were witnessing something impossible made possible. Jimi's fingers moved across the fretboard with surgical precision, finding microtonal spaces between the frets that most guitarists didn't even know existed. He wasn't just bending strings. He was reshaping them, coaxing sounds that seemed to come from another dimension of the instrument. His vibrato was different from anything anyone had heard. Not the wide, obvious wobble that most rock guitarists use, but something subtle, almost vocal, like the natural tremor in a singer's voice when they hit an emotional peak. Each note seemed to breathe, to have its own heartbeat, its own personality. Dwayne's expression changed from curiosity to confusion to something approaching awe. The confidence drained from his face as he listened to his own melody played back to him, note for note, feeling for feeling, but created through a completely different technique. The bass player, Jerry Jemmett, had stopped tuning his instrument and was just staring. The drummer had set down his sticks. Jimi wasn't copying the sound. He was translating it, showing that the emotion Dwayne thought belonged exclusively to slide guitar could be accessed through fingers alone. But more than that, he was demonstrating that the limitation wasn't in the technique. The limitation was in thinking any technique had limitations. But Jimi wasn't done. He kept playing, extending the melody, taking it places Dwayne hadn't thought of, finding harmonies and intervals that worked with the vocal line, but existed in spaces only fingertips could reach. He played notes that rang sympathetically with the open strings, creating natural reverb that made the guitar sound like it was being played in a cathedral. He found spots on the neck where he could achieve the same sustain as a slide, but with the precision that only finger pressure could provide. He was showing not just that he could replicate slide guitar with fingers, but that fingers could go places slides couldn't. The melody became a conversation between different voices within the same instrument, each note building on the last, each phrase opening up new possibilities that Dwayne had never imagined. The room was mesmerized. This wasn't showing off. This wasn't competition. This was education. Jimi was demonstrating that the soul Dwayne talked about didn't live in the slide. It lived in the musician. The slide was just one way to access it. When Jimi finished, he set his guitar down and looked at Dwayne with genuine respect. "That's a beautiful piece of music," he said. "Thank you for sharing it." Dwayne didn't respond immediately. He was processing what he'd just heard, trying to reconcile his understanding of guitar technique with what had just happened. The melody he thought could only exist through slide guitar had just been played, maybe even improved upon, through finger technique he couldn't comprehend. How did you? Dwayne started, then stopped. I just listened to what you played, Jimmy said. Then I tried to find it on my guitar. But those bends, those sustains, you can't get that without a slide. Jimmy picked up his guitar again and played a single note, bending it slowly, making it weep and wail in ways that seemed to defy physics. Different tools, he said simply, same emotions. The session continued, but the energy in the room had shifted. Dwayne played his parts professionally, but the swagger was gone. He kept glancing at Jimmy, trying to understand what he'd witnessed. This wasn't about technique competing with technique. This was about musical understanding that transcended any single approach to the instrument. After the session, Dwayne approached Jimmy as he was packing up his guitar, moving slowly like someone still processing what had happened. Other musicians had already left, but a few lingered, discussing what they'd witnessed in hushed tones by the coffee machine. The engineer was still at his board, probably wondering if he should have rolled tape on what just happened. That thing you did, Dwayne said, his voice quieter than it had been all day. Playing my slide part with your fingers. I've never heard anything like that. I mean, I've been playing slide for 8 years, and I thought I understood what the technique could and couldn't do. You opened my ears to something, Jimmy said, carefully wrapping his guitar cable. I'd never thought about guitar as a voice the way you use that slide. Made me want to find that voice with my fingers. Different path to the same place, maybe. But I was wrong, Dwayne said, the words coming out like an admission he'd been holding back. About what I said earlier, about slide being more real than finger playing, about shortcuts and soul and all that. Jimmy shook his head slowly. You weren't wrong. Slide guitar is real guitar. So is finger playing. So is whatever way you can make the guitar say what you need it to say. Music doesn't judge the method. It just wants to be honest. Dwayne set his Gibson case down and leaned against the studio wall. I've been thinking about guitar wrong, he said, more to himself than to Jimmy. For years, probably. How so? I've been thinking about it like territories. Like slide guitar versus finger guitar. Like there were different teams, different camps, and you had to choose sides. Dwayne paused, looking at his hand, still feeling the phantom weight of the slide on his finger. But you just showed me it's all the same instrument, all the same music, all the same search for truth. They talked for another 20 minutes about technique, about music, about the difference between playing fast and playing right, about the way the blues could be a foundation for anything if you understood its heart instead of just its form. Jimmy shared stories about learning from blues records, about finding his own voice by first learning to disappear into other people's voices. Dwayne talked about growing up in the South, about hearing slide guitar as the voice of something ancient and eternal, about building his identity around being the keeper of that tradition. The tradition doesn't need keeping, Jimmy said as he shouldered his guitar case. It needs growing. What you do with that slide, that's not preserving something old. That's creating something new that honors something old. When Jimmy left, Dwayne sat alone in the studio for nearly an hour. Not playing, just thinking. The cleaning crew came through, emptying ashtrays and straightening chairs around him. He stayed there, holding his Gibson, the slide still on his finger, but seeing both the instrument and the technique differently now. Over the next few months, Dwayne's playing began to change in subtle but profound ways. He didn't abandon the slide, but he started incorporating finger techniques he'd never explored seriously. He began thinking about the guitar as a complete instrument rather than a collection of separate techniques, each fighting for supremacy. His work with the Allman Brothers Band, which was just forming during this period, showed this evolution clearly. The band's sound blended slide mastery with fingerwork in ways that created something nobody had heard before. A synthesis that wouldn't have been possible if Dwayne hadn't learned to see past the boundaries he'd created in his own mind. In interviews years later, Dwayne would tell the story of that Nashville session with a mixture of humility and gratitude. I thought I understood the guitar, he said in a 1971 interview with Guitar Player magazine. I thought slide guitar was the pure form, the truest way to make the instrument sing. Then Jimmy showed me that purity isn't about technique. It's about honesty. The interviewer asked if the encounter had changed his approach to music. Completely, Dwayne said. I realized I'd been limiting myself by thinking in categories. Slide versus fingers, blues versus rock, traditional versus experimental. Jimmy showed me the guitar doesn't recognize those boundaries. The music doesn't care about them either. Did it hurt your confidence? Dwayne laughed. For about 10 minutes. Then it inspired the hell out of me. I went home and practiced harder than I had in years. Not to compete with what Jimmy did, but to understand what he understood. That the guitar has more voices than any of us imagine. When Jimmy died in September 1970, Dwayne was devastated. He'd lost not just a peer, but a teacher. Someone who'd shown him that mastery wasn't about defending territory, but about expanding possibilities. At a concert shortly after Jimmy's death, Dwayne dedicated a slide guitar solo to his memory. But before he played, he told the audience, "This is for Jimmy, who taught me that there are no rules for making the guitar sing, just honesty and the courage to listen to what the music wants to be." The story of that Nashville session became somewhat legendary among session musicians, not because of any dramatic confrontation, but because of what it represented. Two masters encountering each other with open minds and learning something neither had known before. Duane Allman had challenged Jimi Hendrix to prove himself on slide guitar. Instead, Jimmy had shown him that the challenge itself was based on a misunderstanding. There was no competition between techniques, only collaboration between approaches to the same musical truth. Years later, musicians would still talk about that afternoon in Studio B. How Duane Allman's certainty about slide guitar superiority had been gently dismantled by 4 minutes of fingerwork that reimagined everything he thought he knew about his own instrument. But they remembered it not as a defeat for Dwayne, but as a gift. The gift of expanded understanding, of broader possibilities, of recognition that mastery means being forever open to learning something new about something you thought you'd already figured out.